Chapter 10. Mayan Temple 2. Lionel's breathing was erratic. For a long time, he felt a shortness of breath that didn't match with the abundance of air around him, nor his extraordinary physique. He could run a mile with a sub-5-minute time, yet this single exchange left him in shambles. Of course, he knew it wasn't because he was that exhausted, but rather because of his emotional state. Even if this was a game, it was too real. No matter how much he willed it, the dead bodies around him weren't disappearing. In fact, Lionel knew the blood on his hands was actually his own. He had cut his palm on the sword he picked up from the ground the wrong way, but it still made him feel dirty. Water on. Lionel knew he had to pull himself together. Who knew how far away the group they split from had traveled? They had gone too far for Lionel to hear their footsteps anymore, but the screams of these Spaniards had obviously been much louder than footsteps. Steeling himself, Lionel could only push his dark thoughts to the back of his mind. Maybe he was lucky that he was dealing with such a moral dilemma in such a situation. At least he didn't have the luxury to sit and sulk. After making up his mind, he jogged over to the torch he had kicked away during the fight and brought it over. Rummaging through the bodies, Lionel found 3 flat circular-shaped containers of water. Without hesitation, he drained 2 completely before strapping the third to his waist. The wound on his hand and chest were pretty bad, but none of them seemed to carry bandages with them. Luckily, what they did have were flasks of alcohol. Lionel didn't hesitate to grit his teeth and pour it over his wounds. Afterward, he left his chest alone. But for his hand, he snatched the leather guards the Spaniards used for himself. He also slipped on a chest plate and a helm. Of course, he chose the undamaged ones. He took both muskets from the 2 Spaniards who had broken their wrists. He had no idea how to reload them, but he did know how to aim and shoot. Safeties shouldn't have been invented in this era, he didn't think. Either way, he would get 2 shots out of them before discarding them. Finally, he took the 2 best quality swords with him, changing his silver rod back into a bite. Blades of this era likely lost their edge and chipped really easily. Having more than one, especially for attacking armored warriors, was definitely the smartest move. Lionel took a seat on his silver-framed bike, closing his eyes and steadying himself. Soon the sound of rushing footsteps reached him once more. However, it seemed the reason they had taken so long to get this close was because they were lost. After making a mental note to himself to memorize every path he crossed, Lionel's mind flashed with a plan. Not waiting another moment, he got to work. Not even a minute later, he pedaled his bike hard, reaching a dead end quickly. At that moment, the next group of 3 appeared. They too had brought a torch with them, noticing the darkened tunnel. "What the hell is on the floor?" Who pissed themselves? Those barbarian bastards. It seemed the Spaniards had finally noticed the corpses of their companions. "Over there." One of the Spaniards pointed toward Lionel, who was sitting on his bike in the distance. But the reason he had noticed Lionel in the dark at all was precisely because Lionel was holding the same torch he had kicked away in the previous battle. Unfortunately, by the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. A line of fire raced across the stone floors, swallowing the line of alcohol Lionel had drawn and reaching the 3 Spaniards and the 3 corpses in a flash. There was no time to react. A harsh explosion sounded, burying the screams. Using the flames as a light, Lionel brought a musket forward to aim, his hands trembling. However, he knew he had no choice but to shoot. There was no better opportunity to test the range and accuracy of these weapons. The flames had engulfed all 3 of them, but it likely wouldn't kill them in a short time. Steadying his sights as best he could, Lionel fired. The recoil wasn't as bad as he predicted. In fact, he had overcompensated for it far too much. Still, his aim was terrible. There was little he could do about his trembling arms. Lionel could actually see the round bullet fly through the air. It was moving at speeds far beyond the limits of humans, but he could inexplicably track it. He didn't even need for it to land to know he had missed. But that was when the unexpected happened. In their agitated pain, one of the Spaniards fell right into the bullet's path, allowing it to travel directly through his throat. Even as he crumpled to the ground, Lionel bit his lips so hard he drew blood. "Come on, Lionel. You're better than this. Maybe this is why that gene assessment slotted you in to spend the rest of your life throwing balls. That sort of safe profession is just right for someone as pathetic as you." Even as Lionel was berating himself, he still raised his second musket. This time he learned his lesson. His brain did calculations he wasn't even consciously aware of. When aiming, you had to not only account for where your target was, but also where said target would be. With his second shot, the bullet stayed true, flying right through the eye of a second flame-covered Spaniard. Throwing the rifles aside, Lionel gripped the handle of one of his swords. He pedaled down the path lit with flames, not worried that his tires would melt. His bike was far more resilient than that. Like a horseman holding a lance from his steed, he sped toward the final Spaniard with a speed nearing 25 mph. However, even as he did so, he knew he wasn't ready to experience that feeling again. He couldn't stand the disgust he felt as a life dissipated under his own hand. So, in an act of madness, he threw his sword forward with all his strength. It perfectly arched in the air, spinning several times before its sharp edge entered the mouth of the screaming soldier. Like that, the hall fell into silence once more. Except this time, Lionel didn't have the luxury of darkness. He could only dully skid his bike to a stop, looking toward the pile of 6 corpses blankly. Lionel couldn't help but replay everything that had happened in his mind. The moment he remembered the fact guns of this era needed to be loaded with gunpowder during every reload, the rest was simple. Everything from the alcohol flask to his use of the torch was perfectly calculated. But once again, his actions had taken away more lives. It was fine to plan something like this out in your mind, but actually seeing the results painted a picture of something other than success for Lionel. His throw in the end was something that really surprised him. He had subconsciously felt that he could count the number of turns his sword would take in the air and exactly where it would land before it even left his hand. A part of this probably had to do with his years of playing quarterback, but the much larger reason was definitely as a result of his new awakened abilities. He now knew he had great talent for throwing weapons. If he recalled correctly, the Mayans were well known for their throwing spears. If he could find their weaponry, it would be of great help to him. Lionel knew he had to slowly adapt to reaping the lives of others. If he didn't get over his apprehension and fear, he was doomed to die one day. The world outside was no longer the world he had come to know, and the Ascension Empire wouldn't protect him. After yet another deep breath, Lionel took his musket straps off, tossing them to the side. They were no longer useful since he had no idea how to reload them. He would rather not have gunpowder blow his arm off. Withstanding the scorching heat, he pulled his sword from the Spaniard's throat. Then, he pushed his bike backward to gain some distance before building up momentum to leap over the 6 bodies. Only taking a single glance backward, Lionel didn't look again, pedaling down a new corridor to blow out a new line of flaming torches. The cycle continued. Lionel never attacked a group of more than 3, always waiting for them to split down different corridors before he made his move. Eventually, he found a group of Spaniards who carried small hand axes with them, which inevitably replaced his throwing swords. Though he could be accurate with either, the hand axes were more convenient. They were lighter and were better weighted, easing the pressure on Lionel's throwing arm. Aside from this, there also came a point where Lionel carried no less than 5 or 6 rifles on his back. His look would have been quite comical had it not been for his pale face. He had hoped that the longer he spent in this subdimensional zone, the more accustomed he would become. But the reality was that his guilt only grew. Finally, on the 3rd day, carrying bloodshot eyes, Lionel descended a flight of stairs far too narrow for his broad shoulders and found the weaponry he was looking for. Unfortunately, it was flooded with Spaniards. Lionel counted at least 12. To make matters worse, there was no way he could use his normal darkness tactic here. However, there was good news. The narrow stairway he was on was purposely made this way to act as a hidden path. It seemed the Spaniards had yet to notice that the meter-tall stone that covered its exit was a false wall. From here, Lionel was able to peek through the gaps to get a read on the numbers he was facing. After a moment, he gingerly turned, careful not to make any noise as he made his way back up. Though his sneakers were still silent, he had too many things on him now. It was lucky that the Spaniards were laughing it up and having a great time, likely comparing how many barbarians they had killed, or someone would have already noticed the odd scraping sounds. Lionel reached the top of the stairs, re-entering the floor he believed he had cleared. There was nothing but darkness and the stench of blood in this place. Taking out a water jug, he emptied it before tossing it aside. Then he carefully placed the stone that hid the top of the stairs back into place. He wanted to rest after not sleeping for an entire 3 days, but doing so in that narrow corridor was foolish. If anyone found it, he was finished. So, Lionel backed away, rounding a few corners to sit in the dark corner of a dead end. His nerves were still tight, but at some point he grew too tired to avoid sleep any longer. Luckily, he managed to enter the meditative sleep state his father taught him before his consciousness slipped away. The way he looked now, even if a Spaniard somehow managed to stumble upon him, they'd likely believe he was another of their fallen comrades. Blood coated Lionel's face and armor, numerous burn marks, bruises, and cuts running along what small part of his skin were exposed. His sweatpants were in tatters, suffering several cuts through to his thighs and calves due to his lack of experience and recklessness. Lionel had no idea that this sub-dimensional zone wasn't meant to be cleared alone. There was a reason 4 portals had appeared. He could only cling onto his last bit of sanity as he slept in the darkness. Chapter 11, Mayan Temple 3. Lionel's eyes snapped open. He didn't know how long he had slept for. It was impossible to tell. There were no windows in this temple. He had only roughly guessed that he had been here for 3 days. Using his silver rod to stand, he stood to loosen his stiffening limbs. Lionel's jaw set. His mind had regained its clarity. He hadn't even noticed that his senses had severely dulled the more tired he became. In fact, he felt that he was even sharper than when he first entered this sub-dimensional zone now. Without a word, he began to get ready. He took his 6 rifles, strapping through across his left shoulder, then the remaining 3 across his right. 2 days ago, he had almost lost his life because he trusted that these muskets were always loaded. He ended up aiming and firing one without a bullet, a mistake he could thank for the deep gash in his thigh. Since then, he learned to tell whether the rifle was loaded or not first. His method seemed simple, but maybe he was the only one on Earth who could do it. There was a very slight weight difference, maybe fractions of a gram between a loaded and unloaded gun. If a gun was too light, he didn't keep it. Once the 6 muskets laid organized on his back, he accounted for the 8 hand axes around his waist and finally clutched his silver rod. With a deep breath, he slowly made his way back toward the hidden path. It seemed that during his sleep, others entered this floor once more through the main stairway. Lionel could only clear them out first in order to avoid any untoward variables. Though his heart was still heavy, he managed to control his trembling hands this time. Without having to account for his wavering aim, his efficiency reached a new level, his throwing ability especially. Half a day later, Lionel felt that he had emptied the floor once more. With how many Spaniards he had taken it was definitely only a matter of time before their leaders realized that something was wrong. As expected, when Lionel went to peek on the weaponry, the 12 number he had counted before had increased to 18. The weaponry was the largest space Lionel had come across to now. It was a rounded room with a single exit. All around, weapons hung from the walls. But, compared to the Spaniards, they were incredibly crude. The Spaniards turned their noses up at these weapons. Not even a single one had been touched. But who could blame them? It was obvious that Spanish weapon technology was more than a single level higher. They had set up camp in this space for only 2 reasons. One was to stop the Mayans from regrouping and recouping strength, and second was to set up camp. It seemed that this subdimensional zone had deviated from history. There was much more of a stalemate than there should be. An internal battle was taking place within the temple between the 2 parties. What Lionel didn't know was that this was only due to his actions. He hadn't wanted to count the number of Spaniards he had killed, but it was over 100. There were only 2,000 in total. He had single-handedly taken down a good percentage of their army. As a result, the Mayans had been able to put up some resistance. And, due to losing so many soldiers, the Spaniards had taken a step back, trying to reevaluate the strength of their enemy. Lionel took a deep breath. When his eyes opened once more, his eyes had completely stilled, glowing in the dark like a predator stalking his prey. First, he took apart his silver rod. He didn't split it into all 3 pieces. Instead, he only took a single third of it. Using the small ledge on either side of the narrow staircase, he balanced both ends across it. It was nearly a perfect fit, just barely over 2 feet apart. The remaining part of the rod was just over 4 feet in length, but it was enough. If Lionel was lucky, he wouldn't have to use it at all. Ducking beneath the bar, Lionel nodded to himself. Then he began to pour several flasks of alcohol through the small cracks in the false wall, drenching it as quickly as he could. "Hey, do you smell that?" "Smells like some good booze. Who's holding out?" "Drunkard?" What booze? Wait, look over there! The highest-ranking officer of the Spaniards waved his hand, forcing them to fall silent. He wasn't dressed much differently, but his armor was definitely shinier, and he strapped a pike across his back, and a long sword strapped to his waist. Suddenly, the stone was kicked over. It fell with a loud boom, kicking up dust that obscured the dark pathway. Enemy attack! Form up! A strong whoosh followed a flame erupting from the falling stone and the edges it had just been hidden between. Lionel steadied his breathing. Kneeling behind the flames, he aimed his first rifle. He had seen everything he needed in that split second. And still now he could see faint pictures of the changing situation through the flickering flames. He knew he didn't have long. The alcohol would be burned away quickly, and he didn't have any other sources of fuel with him. But he was already ready. Through the short 1-meter-high doorway, he aimed toward the leader and pulled the trigger. Bang! The leading Spaniard who had just been giving out commands froze, his last words being lost in a spurt of blood that came from his eye. Lionel didn't pause. The moment he pulled the trigger, he retreated, leaping up to the ledge above him and to the silver rod piece he laid across them. He squatted down, balancing on the balls of his feet as he crouched across the silver rod. As expected, a rain of bullets sounded an instant later, ricocheting off of the steps below Lionel. Una, tua, 5 Jima, 10, 11, 16, 17. No way that barbarian bastard survived that. The moment the Lionel locked onto the 17th fired gun, Lionel jumped from his perch, charging through the wall of already waning fire. He would have put his rod back together, but he simply didn't have the time. He swung the second rifle from his back, aiming it with a single arm. Bang! He tossed the musket aside even as a Spaniard fell. Without hesitation, he pulled out the third rifle. Bang! With every breath and step, Lionel pulled out another rifle and another Spaniard fell. 5 steps, 5 breaths, 5 rifles, 5 deaths. Lionel dove across the room the moment he dropped his final musket, making it to the side of the leader he had killed. With inhuman strength, he ripped the rifle from his corpse, his lip twitching when he realized it was too light. How could the leader be the only one without a loaded rifle? However, the other Spaniards didn't know this. Lionel couldn't allow himself to be surrounded, so he aimed the gun toward the closest soldier, causing him to retreat with fear coloring the eyes hidden behind his helm. Without hesitation, Lionel tossed the musket aside without bothering to fire, reaching with his now free hand into his belt and pulling out a hand axe. His back drew tight and his arm cocked back, his hand drawing a silver light across the air as he rocketed the axe forward. The very same Spaniard who had retreated had his face destroyed in the blink of an eye, falling to the ground lifeless. Lionel worked quickly. His quick movements hid the dread that loomed over his heart with every life he took. In a flash, there were only 4 left. Lionel picked up the leader's long sword from his corpse, holding it in one hand and his silver rod in the other. With quick steps, he retreated to the secret passageway. The fear Lionel's marksmanship put into the Spaniards was profound. Several of them thought of running, but the punishment for retreat was too severe. They could only hold out and hope the noise would capture the attention of the others. Most of their numbers were working on breaking through the shrine room. Only a few of them were tasked with guarding and resting here. However, when they saw that Lionel had run out of things to throw, they could only steel themselves and charge. Lionel's heart beat quickly. He had become used to fighting many opponents at once, but that was when they couldn't see him. This was completely different. Not only could they see him, but there was one more than he dared to fight alone even in the dark. Calm down now. Over these several days, Lionel had realized something important. These Spaniards were just normal humans, they didn't have an awakened ability. This was where Lionel's advantage lied. Lionel didn't wait for them to close in. He had been planning to retreat to the narrow staircase and take them on one at a time, but this wasn't smart. It might give them time to reload their muskets. He had to stay confident and not give them time to think. In a flash, he ran up to the closest Spaniard. Yelling as though to force all the fear out from his chest, he swung down the long sword with everything he had. If a swordsman saw him, they'd probably look away so as not to cringe. Not only was Lionel wielding a 2-handed sword with just one, but his wide stance and telegraphed movements were terrible, even for a beginner. However, this wasn't an anime. No matter how good a mortal swordsman was, there was a limit to how well they could respond to wild movements, especially when their attacker was so much stronger than them. A scream of agony escaped the Spaniard. His arms hadn't been able to block Lionel's strike. The long sword cut into his shoulder armor and into his collarbone before stopping. Such an injury left a normal human completely crippled. His death was only a matter of time. Lionel ignored the aching in his wrist. Pulling the short sword from the fallen Spaniard, he threw it with all his might across the room, nailing the closest Spaniard in the chin. The blade split his lower lip and jaw in half, leaving him to fall over, dead. The whistle of a swinging sword came from Lionel's left, but he was prepared. Raising his silver rod, he braced himself with all of his strength. Remembering what had just happened to the Spaniard he cut down, he knew the danger of failing to block properly. A sharp clang came. The Spaniard was shocked when he saw that his sword actually chipped against Lionel's seemingly simple rod. How could the alloys of the 2100s not be far better than those from this era? The rebound was violent, but Lionel used his larger frame and power to his advantage, recovering quicker and slashing across with his long sword. Another life fell beneath his blade. This time he had learned his lesson. Cutting through metal was too difficult. This time, he only targeted the exposed vitals, using his great control to emphasize accuracy over power. Picking up another short sword, Lionel turned his hips quickly and reaped the last Spaniard. His chest heaved, hot air billowing into and out of him. A scorching feeling filled his throat and lungs, but he didn't have the luxury of resting. He sprinted with all his might toward the rounded opening of the weaponry. It was easily 2.5 meters tall with a width that was just as large. Its door was a stone circle so massive it should take at least 10 men to move. But Lionel had no choice but to do it on his own. The door was designed to be a size larger than the doorway. As long as he rolled it over from the inside, it would be impossible to open from the outside without destroying the stone first. The sounds of shouts and footsteps filled Lionel's ears. The time he had left was too little, but he dug deep, pulling every ounce of strength he had left out. Argee! Lionel roared with all his might. His senses could pick up on his muscles tearing beneath the pressure, but he had no choice. He pressed hard against the rolling door, finally feeling it move just the slightest bit. The footsteps got closer and closer before Lionel could distinctly hear the shift from walking to sprinting. The barbarians regained their weaponry. Stop them from closing the door! Under the strain, blood flowed from Lionel's nose. His teeth clenched tightly against each other to the point his gums began to bleed. A final roar escaped his lips, snapping the door into its closed position just as the Spaniard attempted to dive through. The ghastly sight of a man being cut in half was the last sight Lionel saw before he blacked out.